Good afternoon to everyone and welcome back from after lunch. Hope you had a good break, hope you had your coffee as well as your necessary bio breaks. Now, I'm going to talk today about the state of the family. And as you would realize, this is going to be much more than just about husbands, fathers, but it also involves sons, grandsons, grandfathers, and much more than that. It involves everyone in society. So with that, let's take a quick look at the big picture at a glance. I'm going to lay out some statistics, and so there are lots and lots of statistics that are going to show up, but just follow along with me because this is going to give you a quick insight into what is happening in society in Singapore. If we look at the statistics about family, I think marriage and divorce would be one of the key statistics we should look at. We notice that in Singapore, there has been a decrease in the number of marriages. After COVID-19, you see a slight upsurge in the number of marriages because people were catching up, but then that number has since gone down. When it comes to divorces, that number has gone up slightly over the years. And so these are the statistics about marriage and divorce as well. What about the age of marriage? We notice that Singaporeans are generally getting married later and later. So compared to about 10 years ago, typically you would have grooms getting married at around about 30 years of age, but then the latest statistics, typically you would see men getting married at about 1 year older than that. And you see similar trends for brides as well. What about parenthood? That follows as well. People are becoming parents later and later in life as compared to previous generations, certainly as compared to even 10 years ago. Moving on, this I think is not news to any of us, but Singapore has an aging population. And by next year, 2026, Singapore is projected to become a super aged society. What does that mean? It means that at least 1 in 5 Singaporeans will be aged 65 years and above. And what else are we looking at? Fertility rates. Again, this is not news to any of us. That fertility rate has fallen and fallen ever since the early days of Singapore. So in 1977, our fertility rate was on the edge of replacement rate of 2.1. In other words, you should have this figure in order for a population to replace itself. But our latest statistics over the past 2 years has been 0.97, and this is a record low fertility rate of all time in Singapore. So what consequences are there with our challenges demographically? We have an aging population, we have low fertility rates. The government has warned of a few things, such as a rise in number of quote-unquote sandwich couples who have to take care of both the young and the old at the same time. You would have a growing number of elderly singles with weaker familial support networks. And I think within our own networks, even our own families, you might be able to see an increasing number of these kinds of people. Perhaps they might be a grand aunt, a grand uncle, an aunt, and so on and so forth, who perhaps never had children, never got married, or perhaps have bad relationships with their families and now are living alone, and they are at risk. They are vulnerable because one day, if anything happens to them, who is going to take care of them? Next, we would have a shrinking local workforce, and that would have economic impacts for Singapore. It would be impacting our competitiveness in the region, in our entire global landscape, and that is not looking pretty when it comes to the economy. And of course, there would be pressures on healthcare and the social support system. And perhaps some of you might be in professions where you already feel that pressure. So let's zoom in a little bit more about some trends, some behaviors, attitudes, and values. We're looking at a society that, as of 2020, majority are dual career married couples. So you have a situation where both husband and wife are working, and that is now the majority and the norm when it comes to family arrangements. Both husband and wife work. Take-up rates of paternity leave as well as maternity leave, unfortunately, are not looking great either. You see that statistics when it comes to maternity leave have fallen slightly over the years. And when it comes to paternity leave, that has increased, also because of increasing understanding of paternity leave, but that number is just slightly over 50% at the moment. Cultivate, we have done our own surveys, and we realized something, that fathers are more likely to say that their companies are reluctant to let them go on paternity leave as compared to mothers when it comes to maternity leave. So you see those figures right there on the screen. When we surveyed people about their attitudes, what do you think the role of a father is? Or what do you think the role of a mother is? Overwhelmingly, we had people answering that, well, material and financial provision should be the role of a father, followed by moral guidance, and then caregiving would come third. Whereas for mothers, you would have things which are pretty much care-oriented, things like providing emotional care and support, caregiving, nurturing, giving love and affection. So you notice that this reflects a certain kind of attitude towards the roles of fathers as well as the roles of mothers, and that is reflected in terms of our attitudes towards parental leave as well. What's more, our survey found that typically, if you looked at who are the main caregivers of children, we looked at it in terms of weekdays, during the day, as well as at night, and weekends, during the day as well as at night. If you see that huge chunk right there, it might be a bit far for you to see this, but you see that huge yellow chunk right there, that refers to mothers. So mothers are still typically the main caregivers on weekdays during the day, as well as at night. You see that 2/3 are mothers when it comes to the nights on weekdays, as well as weekends, the entire weekend basically. Fathers are actually a very, very small proportion. That little pink sliver right there, that's fathers. So fathers are not even among the top 3 main caregivers of children. The top 3 are mothers, childcare, infant care, schools, educational institutions, and thirdly, grandparents. So again, we need to understand the important role of grandparents in this entire ecosystem as well. Next, this should concern some of us. When we look at attitudes towards marriage and children, this is where we see a gap between men and women. For Cultivate, we noticed that for men, they were more likely than women to say that the institution of marriage is beneficial for society. And with regard to the question, Singapore society will be better off with more children. For a society with low fertility rates like ours, you would imagine that the answer should be yes, right? We should have more children. But you find that the men tend to say so more than the women. Basically, you look at these statistics, out of every 10 people, you would have 1 more woman than men who would basically say, no, I don't agree with this, right? You would find that they tend to be less positive towards marriage and children. When you look at younger men and women, and I think some of us right here fall within this age demographic, that figure is even more stark. What you notice is that younger women and younger men, for the younger men, they tend to see things pretty much similar to the older generations. Whether it's the older generation of men, older generation of women, they tend to see things more positively when it comes to marriage and children. But when it comes to younger women, easily you might have as much as 2 in 10, or 1 in 5, in other words, young women saying that, well, I don't quite agree that the institution of marriage is beneficial for society, or that Singapore society will be better off with more children. I think in your personal experience, you may already have seen some of these conversations taking place, and you may already notice that there are indeed differences in views when it comes to younger men and women when it comes to their attitudes towards marriage and children. I remember I was attending one particular conference, not too different from something like this, and I was sitting at a table over lunch with a group of students from junior college, and I was having conversations with them, asking them about their attitudes towards marriage and children, sharing with them a little bit about what Cultivate does, unsurprisingly, we had these young boys saying that, yeah, they were favorable. They wanted to have children, they wanted to get married, and so on. And then we had a group of girls from the same school, wearing the same uniform, right? Basically saying, not quite, no. They were not favorable towards that. So we saw, even in that small conversation, that huge divide between younger men and younger women. The question is why? I can probably speculate as to a few reasons. For one, it could well be that there are very negative voices out there in social media, in the media landscape, that perhaps social media does amplify certain negative voices out there, and perhaps younger women tend to be more influenced by some of these perspectives. That could be one theory. Another theory, which has been put out by some academics, is to say that perhaps these younger women are looking at their mothers or looking at other women in their lives because they are young women. They have generally not had experiences of marriage or parenthood yet, so they're looking at older women. And they're basically seeing that, well, it's a raw deal, right? If I look at how my mother or how my aunt or how all these other women in my life are handling it, looks like marriage and having children is a raw deal because they have to give up more, they have to sacrifice more, they have to do more when it comes to getting married or having children, whereas perhaps the fathers are missing or the husbands are missing, not having to do as much, and so on. So that's another theory. Now, again, we didn't investigate all these theories, so we can only speculate at this point, but from the kind of observations, from the kind of research that we've read, I think these are some of the prevailing theories that are going around out there. So let's sum up in terms of the picture. The picture, in a nutshell, is not pretty. First, we have an aging population in Singapore with a record low total fertility rate that has caused that over time. So we have record low fertility rates of 0.97 in 2023 and 2024. We are projected to become a super aged society by next year. In terms of marriages and divorces, we have a decline in the number of marriages, increase in the number of divorces and annulments. People are generally marrying and having children later. Fathers in our society are typically seen as breadwinners, whereas mothers mainly seen as caregivers. And finally, you have a growing divide between men and women in attitudes towards marriage and family. Now, if these attitudes persist, you can pretty much expect where Singapore will go in a couple of years' time. So with that, let's revisit some key principles about why family actually matters to individuals and to society. And with that, I go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 16.3 says this, that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. So what is very interesting about this particular Declaration of Human Rights is that this is recognized as a fundamental human right in and of itself, that the family has human rights and the family is considered the basic group unit of society. So human rights are not just individual, but they also protect groups. And the family is one of those groups. And Lee Kuan Yew, in his well-known book, From Third World to First, this was published in the year 2000, he said this, quote, "Singapore depends on the strength and influence of the family to keep society orderly and maintain a culture of thrift, hard work, filial piety, and respect for elders and for scholarship and learning. These values make for a productive people and help economic growth." Again, the current Prime Minister said this, "Families have been at the heart of our nation-building journey since the very beginning because families are the bedrock of our society." So when we think about family, we have to trace back in terms of Singapore's development. A very, very much unspoken part about Singapore's development over the years has been the contribution of family, has been the contribution of individual families, individual fathers and mothers, individual children, individual relationships that have been building society in a very, very careful, very quiet, very private, yet consequential kind of way. And when we talk about family, I think we need to understand what we are really talking about and what do we really mean by family. For one, we need to always focus on the needs of children. I know out there may be a lot of ideas about what family actually means, but I like this quote by one particular district judge in a Singapore case, which says this: "Even with prosperous advances in technology, a child is born of the union between a man and a woman. That remains today the starting point of any reasonable discourse on the human identity and the rights of individuals." So when we talk about family, we need to always bear in mind what is the institution that best protects the needs of children. And that includes their right to their father and their mother, the two people who have worked together to bring them into existence. And so it says this right here in the preamble on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality, should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And more so, when we think about family, we need to think about the consequences when we decide to remove any particular one of the family members out of the equation. And so I gathered this from this particular report from the Centre of Social Justice in Britain. And this perhaps would provoke us to think about the idea of masculinity. I know we have had research shared earlier today about the benefits of fatherhood. But think about it from the other perspective. What if fathers are no longer in the picture? And what about this idea of toxic masculinity? Is it true that all masculinity, for example, some people say, is toxic? Or is there actually a positive influence? And these statistics actually tell us that masculinity, the involvement of fathers, actually has a very powerful impact on children, particularly boys. And so I quote from this: "Britain is suffering from an epidemic of fatherlessness. 2.4 million children in the UK have no father figure at home, representing 1 in 5 of all dependent children. Almost half of firstborn children by age 14 do not live with both natural parents. For those born in 1970, this figure was just 21%. The links between father absence and a range of outcomes are increasingly apparent. For example, 76% of children in custody said they had an absent father, with the annual cost of a prisoner being £50,000. Father engagement is imperative for cost saving, reducing the prison population, and life-saving measures." So what we see here is that 76% of children in jail had an absent father. The flip side of the picture is basically that if they had their fathers involved and actively involved, they could have reduced that figure. They could have reduced the criminality that led these children to end up in prison in the first place. And continue to quote from that report: "Fatherlessness in childhood also has a particularly stark impact on the mental health of young men, yet boys are more likely now to own a smartphone than to live with their dad." Think about that statistic. So what does it say about masculinity? That actually fathers have a very important role in shaping the identity, the values, and the habits and the behaviors of the next generation, and that is especially important for boys. The flip side of the picture is this. This was a piece of research produced by the Ministry of Community Development, Youth and Sports. Now it has been renamed to something else. But back then, in 2009, they produced this booklet summarizing international research on the benefits of fatherhood. And so we do recognize the benefits of mothers, but it said this, that fathers and mothers bring unique and complementary contributions to the family. So it makes a unique and crucial difference to children in terms of their social, emotional, and cognitive development, to mothers as partners in the co-parenting relationships, and fathers themselves in their own path of adult development. Quote, "Mothers and fathers often bring different strengths and styles to their parenting roles. Compared to mothers, fathers spend more of their one-on-one interactions with infants and preschoolers in stimulating playful activity, and are more boisterous in their play, not just with sons, but also daughters. From such interactions, children learn how to regulate their feelings and behavior, are more comfortable exploring the world around them, and are more likely to exhibit self-control and pro-social behavior. Now, if you think even about the dynamics between fathers and mothers, and I think Brian alluded to some of these earlier today, think about it. If a child falls down from a bicycle, what is a mother's typical reaction? Oh no, what happened? Oh, poor thing. Okay, come. Are you injured? Are you fine? What is a father's typical reaction? So, is it painful? Is there blood? Anything? No? Okay, carry on please. Yeah. So now, this, of course, I cite from my own anecdotal experience as well, which is generally that. And I think Brian said something which is very, very true. Both parents are trying to protect the child, but protecting the child in different ways. The mother protects the child through nurture, through care, through basically dealing with perhaps any kind of emotional pain, any physical pain, and all that, and there's a role for that. But a father prepares the child by empowering the child, being future ready, by equipping the child with the right skills, with the right understanding of the world, and the ability to learn to pick himself up after falling down. And I think that is that important dynamic. You need both. You need both fathers and mothers to be actively involved for children to understand both perspectives. Imagine if that child only had a mother, or imagine if that child only had a father. I think you would get a great imbalance in their attitudes towards the world. One might end up with a child that is overprotected, maybe very weak, unable to face challenges. The other might end up with a child that is a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too hard, a little bit too uncompassionate towards other people. So we always need both a father and a mother. And when we think about family, we need to realize that the family doesn't just stop at one generation, but is a multi-generational structure. Think about it. I am a father myself, but I'm also a son. I'm also a brother. And I have many other relationships down the line. So family connects us, both past, present, and future. That is what makes family such an institution that endures across time. But perhaps some of us here might be wondering, and even though this is a husbands and fathers track, some of us here might be in a stage of singleness, and you might be wondering, okay, well, what if I'm single? What if I have no children? Now, let's think about an analogy from another institution, the justice system. So, for example, you might not be a policeman, you might not be a lawyer, you might not be a judge, you might not ever be involved in any lawsuits with anyone, any criminal proceedings brought against you, and you may have never been involved in making or breaking any laws, either as a lawmaker or a criminal in any sense. But if you live in a society where the justice system is broken, everybody suffers. So, when you talk about family, family is an institution in society. So, you may not be a father or a grandfather, you may not be a brother or a cousin to anyone, but at the very least you are a son of both a father and a mother, and you're certainly part of society. So, family is more important than your personal relationships at this point in time. It is a social institution, and when that is broken, everyone suffers. So let's summarize some key principles. So first, men and women are unique and complementary, both in family and society. Fathers and mothers each bring unique contributions to the holistic development of children. We need to put children's best interests first in order to ensure a sustainable society, and family is the foundational building block of society. Strong families contribute to the common good, and when families thrive, society thrives too. What we have seen from the statistics I highlighted earlier would be the converse of that. When families are not doing well, society suffers, and our fertility rates, our aging population are some signs of that. So some reflections for us, and I'll share some lessons that I've learned. First, as a teenager. Second, as a father. And third, from my father. So, quick sharing. Myself, I grew up as a teenager who played too many video games, and perhaps some of us might identify with that. For me, I faced various setbacks when I entered secondary school. So I began to fail subjects, I wasn't doing well on this or that. And the more I was unsuccessful, the more I felt like, okay, I needed some outlet, I needed some way of escape. So playing computer games became that way of escape. It gave me a semblance of achievement and community like a team sport. But a math teacher helped turn things around. She called marking homework a hobby. She was the kind of person who, if we submitted a piece of homework to her, the next day she would return it fully graded, and she would actually be open to consult and give insights and all that. So sometimes a teenager needs someone just to believe in him and is dedicated to helping him succeed. Next, as a father. Well, my first child, a boy, was born in September 2022, and I had this conversation when my wife was pregnant. So this was prior to my son being born. I asked this colleague at the time, well, how do you balance work and caregiving and all that? And he gave me this word, priorities. He said, it all depends on how you prioritize things. So that shook something in my heart and my mind, and I realized, yes, I needed to do that. So I stepped back from full-time legal practice, took on a more flexible job, which is the one I'm currently having now, and to provide care for my son. And I wrote this in a Straits Times piece. There are experiences in life that can make us feel as if we have transcended ourselves and touched something deep and profound. This might be the sight of magnificent scenery or the melody of a rousing orchestra. One cannot even describe the beauty in words, but it is undeniable. One has to be immersed in the depths of the experience to understand it, just like with parenthood. What if all our study and work are actually meant to support family? And a strong family, in turn, supports every other social institution in society as its basic building block. So, that was my insight when it came to fatherhood, to family. And next, with our aging population, I think we need to face this reality. Retirement tends to hit men hard, and it hits hard in several aspects. First, there's a loss of identity, meaning and purpose, loss of social connection, and there's a decline in physical and mental health for some, and for some people who have been sole breadwinners all their lives, perhaps they may have not so good relationships with their family in the first place. So it hits them hard because it cuts them off from much of their identity, meaning and purpose that they've derived all their lives. So for most of my growing up years, my father was indeed pretty much the kind of traditional Asian father, right? My father worked, my mother was a homemaker for a large part of my growing up years. And yet, once my father entered semi-retirement and grandchildren came along, he reinvented himself. He became the active grandfather who would fetch children to and from school. He helped to babysit grandchildren. He helped to fix things in his children's house. So, for example, my father would drop by and help to fix this or that was broken. Even though I could theoretically learn and do it myself, or I could theoretically do some of these things myself because I already knew how to do them. But he reinvented himself as that active father and grandfather. And he was willing to learn and adapt, to do things that are traditionally quote-unquote women's roles, things like feeding the children, bathing the children, changing diapers. It's not as if he liked to do them. If he had a choice, he still wouldn't. But at the very least, he was willing to grow and adapt. So this growth process, as I see it, is essentially like this. First, we start out dependent. Then we grow towards independence. And the final stage, and I think that's where we should all aspire to be for as long as possible, is to be a dependable person. So, across all stages in life, we have a deep desire for a meaningful goal, an objective or purpose that is higher than ourselves, a community that works together towards that goal, objective or purpose, and young people need adults, sometimes older youth, to believe and guide them, and to be willing to learn, adapt, and grow at different stages in life. So, we also know that family gives a strong sense of meaning and purpose as well as relationships, and we should make family a priority. So, here are some quick recommendations. First, I think we should inspire a moral vision for boys and men to aspire towards. Second, we should practice positive mentorship and role modeling. If you think about institutions like National Service or the Boy Scouts, they are pretty much based on this. Set a goal, have mentors, work towards that goal together. And finally, cultivate healthy relationships between men and women, and that includes sexuality. So with that, I conclude by sharing some lessons from an iconic film, and I think we are all familiar with this film, 1994 cartoon The Lion King. First, you hear about this young lion Simba, right? He begins as a reckless cub who can't wait to be king. Tragedy hits, his father is killed. He hangs out with two outcasts and becomes a carefree young adult who sings about, quote unquote, no worries for the rest of your days. One day, his girlfriend comes along and tells him that, your kingdom is now ruled by a usurper, a tyrant, your uncle called Scar. But Simba doesn't care. The turning point comes when the spirit of his dead father tells him to remember who you are. You are the one true king. And then he returns to challenge the usurper Scar and assumes his place as the rightful king and continues the circle of life by becoming a father himself, starting his own family. What can we learn from this? I think some very important lessons. First, remember your roots. Second, take on responsibility. Third, confront evil. And four, bring peace and stability to family and society. So remember, family is personal, yes, but it is also societal. What you do in your family life has a profound impact on the rest of society. And so I'll end off with this quote from Mufasa to young Simba: remember who you are. Thank you.